I work the night shift at a water treatment facility on the edge of a town that nobody has heard of, and I have been doing it for 11 years without incident. The facility sits between a dried riverbed and a stretch of dead farmland, and the nearest house is 4 miles east. My job is simple: monitor the pressure gauges, log the chemical levels every 2 hours, walk the perimeter at midnight, and call the supervisor if anything reads outside the normal range. Nothing ever reads outside the normal range. That is the whole point of a job like this. You are paid to be present, not to be useful. I used to bring books. Then I brought a small television. Then I stopped bringing anything, because after enough years, the silence becomes something you wear rather than something you endure. And I had grown comfortable inside it. The night it happened was a Tuesday in late October. I remember the day because I had eaten at the diner on Route 9 before my shift. And Tuesdays are when they serve the beef stew I like, and I had been thinking about it all afternoon. I got to the facility at 10 minutes to 11, signed in on the paper log by the front gate, and walked to the main monitoring room. The fluorescent light above the door was flickering in the way it had been flickering for 3 weeks. And I had submitted the maintenance request twice and been ignored twice. So I had learned to work under the strobing without thinking about it. Everything on the board was normal. I made my first log entry at 11, drank half a thermos of coffee, and sat in the chair that had molded itself to my body over the course of a decade. At around midnight, I did the perimeter walk. The perimeter is a concrete path that runs around the outer edge of the facility, past the primary filtration tanks, past the chemical storage building, past the pump house, and back to the main entrance. It takes me 9 minutes at a normal pace. I have timed it many times. I brought a flashlight and my radio, and I walked the path the way I always walk it, which is to say without urgency and without much attention. The tanks were dark and humming the way they always hum. A low mechanical sound you feel more in the chest than hear with the ears. The chemical storage building was locked. The pump house was locked. I was almost back to the entrance when my flashlight crossed something on the path that made me stop. It was a shoe. A single leather shoe, brown, men's, sitting upright on the concrete as though someone had placed it there deliberately. I stood and looked at it for a moment. My first thought was that someone from the day shift had left it, which made no sense because a man does not leave one shoe at a water treatment facility. My second thought was that it had blown in from somewhere, which also made no sense because it was upright and the night was still. I looked around the path in both directions. Nothing. I looked out toward the dead farmland. The flashlight reached maybe 30 feet into the dark before the beam thinned and dissolved. I did not see anything. I picked the shoe up, turned it over, put it against my light. It was not new, but it was not worn out either. Size 10. There was no name inside, no marking. The sole was damp, not from rain because there had been no rain, but from something else. I carried it back to the monitoring room and set it on the floor next to my chair and wrote in the log that I had found foreign material on the perimeter path, which is what we are supposed to write when we find something that should not be there. At 1, I made my second chemical log. At 1:30, I heard a door, not the front entrance, which has a buzzer and a keypad and a heavy magnetic seal that makes a sound like a struck bell when it opens. This was something else. It came from the direction of the pump house, which I had checked 45 minutes earlier and found locked. The pump house door is steel, and it sits on hinges that have never been oiled in my memory. And when it moves, it makes a long scraping complaint that carries well in open air. I heard it open, and I heard it close. I sat very still and listened to the facility hum. Then I picked up the radio and called the supervisor on duty, whose name was Gerald, and who answered after 4 rings with the voice of a man who had been asleep. I told him I had heard the pump house door. He asked if the alarms had triggered. I looked at the board. They had not. He said the door sometimes moves in wind. I told him there was no wind. He said it was probably an animal that had gotten inside somehow. He told me to go check it and call him back if I found anything, and then he was quiet in a way that meant he had gone back to sleep. I did not want to go check it. I want to be clear about that. I am not a man who is easily unsettled. And in 11 years I had investigated loose panels and flooded drains, and once a man from the county who had climbed the outer fence on a dare and was sitting on top of a filtration tank at 3 in the morning, drunk and singing. I had handled all of it without much difficulty, but something about the shoe had moved a peg inside me that I could not move back. And I did not want to walk out to the pump house. I went anyway, because that is the job. I took the flashlight and the radio, and I walked the path again, and the night was the same as it had been, still and cool, and smelling faintly of the chemical treatment that hangs in the air around a facility like this. The pump house door was closed when I reached it. I tried the handle. It was locked. I put my ear against the steel and listened. The pumps inside make a constant rhythmic sound, a push and pull that I know as well as my own breathing, and it was there, steady and unchanged. I stood outside for perhaps 2 minutes. Nothing moved. I walked back. I wrote in the log that I had checked the pump house and found it secure. At 2, I made the third chemical log, and at some point after that, I fell into the shallow half-sleep that I sometimes fall into in the chair when the night is long and nothing is happening. Not fully unconscious, but not present either. The kind of rest where you are still vaguely aware of the hum of the building and the flicker of the light above the door. What pulled me back was not a sound. It was the absence of one. The pumps had stopped. I was out of the chair before I was fully awake, looking at the board, and every pressure reading had dropped to 0. Not a malfunction. Not a trip switch. The kind of 0 that means the pumps are not running. I called Gerald and he did not answer. I called the emergency maintenance line and was put on hold. I went to the board and began running the restart protocol, which is a sequence of switches and checks that I had rehearsed in training and never used. And while I was doing that, I became aware that the monitoring room door, which opens inward and which I always leave open, was closed. I had not closed it. I stood at the board and looked at the door and did not move for what felt like a long time. The maintenance line came back and a man asked me to describe the problem, and I described it, and he said he would dispatch a technician and that it would be 40 minutes minimum. I said I understood. The door had a small wired glass window at head height, the kind of reinforced glass with the mesh inside, and through it I could see the corridor that runs to the front entrance. The corridor fluorescent was on. It was empty. I finished the restart protocol and the pumps came back online and the pressure readings climbed back to normal over the course of about 4 minutes. I wrote all of it in the log. I did not open the door for a long time. When I finally did, the corridor was empty in both directions, and the front entrance was sealed, and the keypad showed no entry or exit since my arrival. The technician came at 3:40 and found nothing wrong with the pumps. He said sometimes they trip for no documented reason, and that it had happened before. I showed him the shoe. He looked at it for a moment and handed it back without saying anything. When my shift ended at 7 and the day's supervisor arrived, I handed over the log and mentioned the shoe and the door and the pumps, and he nodded and wrote something on his clipboard. I drove home in the early morning light and ate something I do not remember and went to sleep. 2 weeks later, I was doing the perimeter walk and I found the other shoe. Same spot on the path, upright, damp on the sole. I stood there in the dark and looked at it and looked out into the dead farmland beyond the fence, and I called Gerald, and he answered, and I told him what I had found, and he was quiet for a moment, and then he asked if the alarms had triggered. They had not. I wrote it in the log. I still work the night shift. I still do the perimeter walk. I have not found anything since. but I do not fall asleep in the chair anymore. And I do not leave the monitoring room door open. And every 2 hours when I make the chemical log, I check the board twice before I sit back down. Because the thing that frightens me is not what I found. It is that I do not know what was standing at the door while I was looking at the board, or what walked the perimeter path before I did, or where it went, or whether the pumps stopped because something stopped them or because whatever was in the pump house needed me to open the door. I moved into the house on a Tuesday, which I've always considered a forgettable day, and perhaps that's why I didn't pay attention to the details the way I should have. The landlord handed me the keys at the door, didn't step inside, and shook my hand with the kind of grip that ends a conversation rather than opens one. I noticed he kept his eyes on the street behind me while we spoke. I told myself he was simply a busy man. The house was a 2-story Victorian on the edge of a small town in rural Vermont. The kind of town where the gas station closes at 7 and the locals don't ask where you're from because they don't particularly want to know. I was 34, recently divorced, working remotely as a technical writer for a software firm, and I wanted silence. The house gave me silence. It gave me more than I asked for. The first week passed without incident, if I'm being precise. There was the usual adjustment, learning which floorboards creaked, which faucet needed 2 full turns to stop dripping, where the light died in the late afternoon and left the hallway genuinely dark. I unpacked my boxers slowly, arranged my furniture without enthusiasm, and cooked simple meals in the kitchen that smelled faintly of someone else's cooking. A ghost of cumin and something burnt, embedded in the walls, the way old smells are. I slept well those first nights. That matters, because it didn't last. The noise began on the 8th day. I was at my desk near the window, reading through a product manual I was revising, when I heard it from the floor directly above me, the second bedroom, which I was using for storage. It was a dragging sound. Not loud, not dramatic. The sound of something being moved a short distance across a wooden floor, then stopped. I sat still and listened. It didn't repeat. I went upstairs, opened the door, and found the room exactly as I'd left it, boxes stacked against the far wall. A rolled-up rug in the corner, dust on the floor undisturbed. I stood there for longer than necessary, then went back downstairs and attributed it to the house settling. Old houses speak. I knew that. It happened again 3 nights later at 2:14 in the morning. I know the time because I looked at my phone when I woke up. The same sound, a slow, deliberate drag across the floor above my bedroom. I lay still and counted the seconds. It lasted perhaps 4 seconds, then silence. I got up. I told myself I was being rational. I took the kitchen knife from the counter, which I now realize was both reasonable and useless, and went upstairs. Nothing. The boxes hadn't moved. The rug was in its corner. The dust on the floor was unbroken except for my own footprints from the previous visit, which were still visible. I checked the window, locked. I checked the closet, empty. I stood in the center of the room with a knife in my hand and felt, for the first time, genuinely foolish. I went back to bed and didn't sleep until it was light. I mentioned it to no one for 2 weeks. I want to be clear about that because later people would suggest I was primed by suggestion or social influence. And I want the record to show that I experienced everything that followed incomplete. Isolation before I spoke a word about it to anyone. During those 2 weeks, the dragging sound became a regular event, not nightly, but frequent enough that I began to expect it. I started leaving a layer of flour on the storage room floor. Spread thin, the way I'd read you could detect animal movement. Each morning, I would check it. Each morning, it was undisturbed. Whatever was making the sound was not touching the floor. I understood that was not a comforting conclusion. I began sleeping with the recorder function on my phone running. I have those files still. If you listen closely at the correct timestamps, which I've marked, you can hear the dragging. It sounds exactly as I described it. Slow, measured, approximately 4 to 6 seconds in duration, and it comes from above the microphone, from the ceiling of my bedroom, from the floor of the room above. I played it for an audio engineer I contacted online, a man who works in forensic sound analysis, and he told me the sound was consistent with a dense object being moved across hardwood. He said it showed no signs of digital manipulation. He asked me what the object was. I told him I didn't know. He didn't respond after that. The smell came in October, about 6 weeks after I moved in. I came home from a drive one evening and the house smelled different. Not bad, exactly. Not like rot or damp. It smelled the way a room smells when someone has been sitting in it for a long time, a faint warmth. Biological, the specific odor of an occupied space. It was concentrated at the top of the stairs. I stood at the bottom and breathed it in and felt my skin respond before my mind caught up, the hair on my arms rising in that old animal way. The body deciding something before the brain has the language for it. I went upstairs. The storage room door was closed. I always left it open. I opened it and the smell was stronger there and warmer, and the flour on the floor had been disturbed. Not with footprints. With what I can only describe as a wide, smooth impression, like something had lain down in it. An oval shape, roughly the length of a person. I left the house that night. I drove to a motel 40 minutes away and sat on the edge of the bed with my coat still on and called my sister, who is pragmatic and does not indulge what she calls my tendency toward dramatization. I told her what had happened in sequence without embellishment. She was quiet for a moment and then asked if I had a carbon monoxide detector. I did. It had never triggered. She suggested I come stay with her for a few days. I said I would think about it. I didn't go. I went back the next morning, in daylight, and photographed the impression in the flour and reset the layer. Then I drove to the town's small library and asked the librarian, a woman in her 60s who had lived there her entire life, about the history of the house. She didn't look up from what she was doing when I gave her the address. She finished whatever she was writing, set down her pen, and then looked at me. She asked how long I'd been there. I said 2 months. She nodded as though this confirmed something and told me that the previous occupant, a man named Gerald Prout, had lived in that house for 30 years before dying in it. She said he'd been found in the upstairs bedroom, not the storage room, his bedroom, and that he had been dead for some time before anyone discovered him. She said the coroner estimated 3 weeks. She said the neighbors had noticed the smell. She said this the way people in small towns say terrible things, with the flatness of long familiarity. I asked if there was anything else I should know. She looked at me for another moment and then said that Gerald Prout had been a large man, and that in his final years he had rarely left the house, and that people who knew him said he had difficulty walking and moved himself around by holding onto the walls and furniture, dragging one leg behind him. She said this slowly, and I understood she knew why I was asking. I thanked her. I drove back to the house. I stood outside it for a long time before going in. I don't know what I believe. That is the honest answer, and I'm tired of people wanting more than the honest answer. I stayed in the house for 4 more months. The sound continued. The smell came and went. Once in December, I woke at 2:14 again, that exact time. Not approximately exactly, and lay in the dark and listened to the dragging above me and did not move. And while I was lying there, I became aware of a sound I had not heard before beneath the dragging, fainter, rhythmic, that it took me a full minute to identify. It was breathing, not mine. I was holding my breath. It was slow and labored, and it came from directly above my head, from the ceiling. From the floor of the room where a large man once lived and apparently still, in whatever manner of speaking, applies, does. I moved out in February. I left the furniture. I left the boxes. I left the flour on the floor of that room, and I did not check it before. I closed the door and walked down the stairs, and out into the cold, and got in my car and drove away without looking back at the house, because I did not want to see the upstairs window, and because I was afraid at that point of what it might mean if no one was standing in it. I found the neighbor's car still in the driveway at 11:40 on a Tuesday morning, and that was the first thing that felt wrong. Dennis worked at the County Water Authority and had not missed a shift in 11 years. He had told me this himself, with the particular pride of a man whose life runs on routine. I noticed his car because I was taking out recycling, the way I do every Tuesday before noon, and the silver Nissan was sitting at an angle, slightly off from where he usually parked it, as if he had pulled in fast or distracted. I told myself he was sick. I've told myself a lot of things that morning. I live alone in a 2-story house on Orchard Fell Road, a street with 7 properties on each side, most of them occupied by people who wave from driveways and remember your name but do not know much else about you. Dennis Hale was the closest thing I had to a friend on that street. He was 53, divorced, kept a clean yard, and occasionally left vegetables from his garden in a bag on my porch. I had lived next to him for 6 years. I knew where he kept his spare key, under the 3rd flagstone from the porch steps, because he had shown me after locking himself out 2 winters ago. I want to be precise about this because everything that came after turns on that detail. By 2 in the afternoon, I had gone back outside twice on small pretexts and looked at his house both times. The curtains on the ground floor were drawn, which was unusual. Dennis opened his curtains in the morning, always. He had mentioned once that his ex-wife used to sleep with the curtains shut, and that after the divorce. He made a point of letting the light in every single day. Small details like that stay with you. The curtains being shut bothered me more than the car. I went back inside and made coffee and told myself he had a stomach bug, maybe a migraine, and that I was manufacturing a problem because I was bored and anxious in the way people who live alone sometimes become. At 4:15, I knocked on his door. I want to be honest. Part of me hoped he would not answer, because that would mean I could stop thinking about it. I knocked twice, waited, knocked again. Nothing. I pressed my ear to the door, which I have never done before and felt foolish doing. Silence, but a particular kind of silence. The silence of a house that has something in it rather than nothing. I cannot explain the difference precisely, except to say that an empty house feels empty in a physical way, and this did not feel that way. I stepped back and looked up at the 2nd floor windows. Nothing moved. I found the spare key under the 3rd flagstone. My hands were steady, which surprised me. I told myself I was checking on a neighbor, which was the truth, and that I would call his name from the door and he would shout back from upstairs that he was fine. Just tired, and I would feel embarrassed and relieved in equal measure. I unlocked the door and pushed it open and called his name into the hallway. The smell reached me before anything else. Not decomposition. I want to be careful here, because people assume the worst, and I am trying to tell this accurately. It was something else, something metallic and warm. Like the smell inside a car that has been sitting in the sun with something biological left on the seat. Dense, personal. I stood in the doorway with 1 foot inside, called his name again. My voice sounded different in that hallway than it sounds anywhere else. Flatter somehow, as if the air in there absorbed it differently. The hallway was clean and ordinary. Coat rack on the left, shoes on the mat, small table with his keys, and a coffee mug. The coffee mug had a brown ring inside it, dried, the kind you get when you pour a cup and walk away and forget it. I focused on that for a moment. I walked to the entrance of the living room and looked in. The curtains were shut and the room was dim, and it took my eyes 2 or 3 seconds to adjust. He was in the armchair, facing the television. sitting upright, hands on his knees, head tilted slightly to the right. The television was off. I thought for one strange second that he was asleep, that his chest would rise, and I would feel absurd standing in his living room uninvited. And then I understood that it would not rise. I understood this the way you sometimes understand things before you have processed them consciously, before the logical part of your mind has caught up. I took one step into the room and stopped. I did not scream. I did not feel the things I would have expected to feel. I felt something more like the bottom falling out of the ordinary world. A quiet lurch, the way you feel when you step off a curb you did not see. I stood there and looked at him and understood that he had been dead for some hours and that his face had settled into an expression of profound concentration, as if he had been listening very carefully to something in the last moments and had not resolved what it was. His eyes were open, which I wish I could forget. I backed out of the room. I did not touch anything. I took my phone from my pocket in the hallway and called the emergency number and spoke to someone, in a calm voice that did not sound like mine, describing the address and the situation in the plain procedural language that comes over you in crisis. Not because you are brave, but because the brain defaults to function when it cannot afford anything else. The dispatcher asked me to wait outside, and I did. The police and then the paramedics came within 8 minutes. I stood on the front lawn and watched them go in. A young officer took my statement and I gave it. And at some point, a paramedic came outside and said something to his colleague in a low voice and caught the word presentation and nothing else. They told me later, 2 days later, that Dennis had died of cardiac arrest. Undiagnosed hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, the coroner said. He had probably sat down in the chair on Monday evening and been dead within minutes. The cause was medical and clean and entirely explicable, and I do not dispute any of it. What I have not told the police or anyone is what I saw when I backed out of the living room. I said I did not touch anything, and that is true. But as I turned in the hallway to walk to the front door, I glanced, for no reason I can articulate, at the small table by the coat rack. Dennis's keys were there, and the coffee mug with the dried ring and something else that I did not notice on my way in. A second mug, clean, unused, sitting beside the first. 2 chairs in his living room, I remembered. One he used, one he never sat in, the one that faced the window. I had been in that living room before for a beer, twice, and the second chair was always turned toward the window, as Dennis had arranged it after his wife left, because he said he liked the way the light came through the curtains in the afternoon. It was turned inward when I stood there, facing the armchair where he sat. I have thought about this every day since. I have constructed explanations. He rearranged the furniture. He had a visitor. I was wrong about the chair, misremembering. I run through these explanations carefully, and I find them reasonable, and I reach the end of them, and I am still standing in that hallway, looking at the 2 mugs on the table, and I cannot get myself to feel settled about any of it. I still live on Orchard Fell Road. The house next door has been empty for 2 months. A realtor's sign went up last week. I open my curtains every morning, and I keep my spare key under the flagstone, and I try to live in the way that Dennis lived, clean and routine and careful. Most mornings, I succeed. But there are evenings when the light is going and the street is quiet, and I pass through my hallway and catch a glimpse of my own kitchen table, when I count the chairs without meaning to. I count them, and I hold the number in my mind, and I stand very still until I am certain I have it right.